Hey, good morning, Pete, North Las Vegas. This will be video 3 of my LR308 build. This is the second LR308. I did a whole video series on the first one, and I'm using new Frontier Armory receivers again. Everything on this build was going very smoothly. We got the magazine catch in there. We got the bolt catch, the trigger, the selector, the pistol grip. We got the rear pin installed. Everything was going good until we got to the front pivot pin. And so we'll get into the issues I had with that on the first install. But before we get into all the details of the pivot pin and what I'm going to do to try to get a nice snug fit, we're going to talk about the golden cannonball. And this story is only going to take a minute or two, so we'll get to the actual pivot pin as soon as we're done with the golden cannonball story. Okay, so as the story goes, this happened back in China. And it wasn't too long after the Chinese figured out how to take black powder and weaponize it and turn it into gunpowder. So after they figured out how to weaponize it, they came up with cannons and other devices that would use the gunpowder to launch projectiles. And so anyway, China was getting ready to have a pretty big battle with a very worthy adversary at the time. And the Emperor of China did not want to lose this battle. He wanted to win. So he got all of his armies in China from all different parts of China, northern, southern, east, western, central China, and he combined all his armies to make sure that, he was going to win this battle. So anyway, all these armies got together, and they got on the battle line. And even though the Chinese outnumbered their adversaries 2-1, he was relying quite a bit on his cannons and gunpowder devices to win the battle, to make sure that he won. Well, the Chinese came very close to getting their ass kicked. They still won the battle, but they almost lost. And what had happened was when he gathered up all of his armies, each army had their own cannon and cannonball sizes. And when he gathered up the armies, the cannonballs and the cannons had gotten mixed up on the battlefield. So when the battle got started, some cannonballs wouldn't fit in the cannons. Other cannonballs were just too small. And so there was all kinds of things that were going wrong because all the dimensions and there was no standardization for their cannons. So anyway, the Emperor was he was a pretty wise guy, and he came up with the idea of the golden cannonball. And so what he did was he had his designers and engineers create what was called the golden cannonball. He got all his generals together from all the different armies, and he said, from now on, every cannon in my kingdom will be able to fire and use the golden cannonball. So according to this story in folklore, this is how calibration was born. And so we're going to see who has been using the golden cannonball on this receiver and who has been using the golden cannonball on the pivot and takedown pins. Okay, so one last thing on this golden cannonball story. There's an organization that used to be called National Bureau of Standards, and they are the gatekeepers of all things golden cannonball. And I think it was early 80s they changed the name to NIST, National Institute of Standards Technology. So in this country, these are the gatekeepers of the golden cannonball. They can tell you physical, mechanical, dimensional, electrical, electronic, 8, 9, 10 places to the right of the decimal. So if you want to know exactly what 1 volt is, 1 ohm, 1 amp of current, you want to know what 1,000th of an inch is, whatever you're trying to measure, as I was saying, they are the gatekeepers of the golden cannonball, National Institute of Standards Technology. Okay, so for a DPMS pattern, I don't know for a fact, but I think AR10, A and B are the same dimensions, but I'm not positive about that. Pretty sure they are. But the nominal is 0.28 inches plus or minus 1,000. And that's the diameter, the internal diameter ID of this pinhole. So that would be the ideal, perfect size, golden cannonball. Now, plus or minus 1,000 means that we can still be in spec at 0.279 and 0.281. The Chinese emperor was not completely unreasonable. He knew that his generals wouldn't be able to make all of the golden cannonballs exactly 0.280. So he said, I'll give you a range. And if you can get your cannonballs within this range, you and your family get to live. Okay, so most calipers, whether they're dial indicating like this, vernier, or electronic, usually under 8 inches in length are plus or minus 1,000th. On your calipers, if you get above an 8-inch caliper, generally you're going to start getting into plus or minus 2,000ths. These are a cheap set of calipers, but I've kind of compared them against more accurate stuff, and these are within plus or minus 1,000th, so we should be able to get a decent reading. Okay, so according to my measurement, I'm coming in at 0.279, which is where I want to be. I want that pin bore to be on the low side, ideally. And depending on how I hold it, I can change the reading a little bit. But it comes in off camera right at the low end of the range, 0.279, according to these. Okay, so new Frontier Armory, good job. Thanks for using the golden cannonball. Anyway, because the ID comes in at 0.279, what I'm going to be looking for on the pins is 0.278 would be like perfect. 0.277, pretty good. If my pin diameter gets too much smaller than that, I'm going to start getting a lot of slop in the receiver between the upper and lower. So ideally, I would like to stay around 0.278, 0.277. Let's get into the problems I had. Okay, so in a previous video, I had installed the Aero Precision front pivot pin, and that's the Aero Precision that's still installed in the rear. And I'll be taking that out too. It works, it's just sloppy. And we'll get into that here in just a second. Anyway, the issue I had with the Aero Precision was everything worked out dimensionally, except there was something wrong with this dimension here where the detent pin slides into the hole and latches this pin in. It wouldn't latch unless I took a mallet and gently tapped on it. And even then, it wasn't a good latch. It didn't take a whole lot of finger pressure to push that pin back out. It just wasn't latching in properly. So I'll try to demonstrate that using the outside hole of the receiver. Okay, so on the fully closed position, that detent hole that's drilled in the channel here would not fully engage with the detent. So when I close this, if I keep a little pressure on the detent, it will engage just barely enough to hold it. But if I just take a slightest amount of pressure off and just barely touch this. Now this is doing the same thing installed with the spring and everything else. And so if you look at the pinhole here, or the detent hole, and I'm going to push this pin back in. We'll take the detent out, and you can see that, sorry about the camera work, you can see that that detent hole is not quite lined up with the hole on the receiver. So it doesn't get a good purchase. And so that was the first issue with the Aero Precision pin. Now I'm saying it's a pin issue, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. I've decided that it's not the receiver, it's not where they drilled the receiver hole for the detent. It's the pin that's out of spec. Okay, so in addition to the Aero Precision having a detent pinhole being slightly off, and like I said earlier in the earlier clip, I'm pretty satisfied at this point. When we get to the rest of the pins, you'll see that that pinhole's just not in the right place. The other issue with the Aero Precision is they both came in at 0.275. And that's the Aero that's still installed here. And it's got a lot more slop than I want. I also measured the rear bores here on the receiver, and it also came in at 0.79 according to my calipers. So it's on the small side of the range as far as the pin bore. So it's not the receiver. These are undersized. So we won't be using Aero Precision. Okay, so after we figured out that the front pivot pin, Aero Precision, had a problem and both pins were undersized, I went down to New Frontier Armory, their brick and mortar store here in North Las Vegas, and bought the New Frontier Armory pin set. This front pin, everything worked out good as far as latching into place, but I had another issue. I actually had two issues with this pin. One, you can see the channel. It's not machine straight. Now, I had the same issue on another pin kit that I bought from New Frontier on the first build. And you're going to see another problem here that I had with the New Frontier Armory. Besides that channel not being machine straight, I don't know how well. I think that's a good angle there. You can see where it's not right. But this one latches in, but I had another issue with the front pivot pin. Okay, so on the New Frontier Armory, when you pull the pin out and you engage it into the detent, you can see how much of that pin is still sticking into the receiver channel. And that's enough to prevent the receiver from being installed into the lower. So besides the channel being a little dorked up, New Frontier Armory didn't get the fully open position detent hole drilled correctly, or they made the pin too long. Now, on the first LR308 build I did, I went ahead and filed that down because the first New Frontier Armory pin had the same issue. And I filed that down until I could get it in and blued it, and it didn't turn out too bad. It looked okay, but in the end, I just decided, nah, I'm gonna try to find another pin that fits better. So now we have a New Frontier Armory front pin that doesn't work and an Aero Precision front pivot pin that doesn't work. Okay, so back to the New Frontier Armory for just a second. The front pin came in at 0.277, that's pretty good. Too bad the detent pinholes are screwed up on that one too. One of the rear takedown pins was from the old kit that I had from the first build, and one of them's the new one. One of them came in at 0.275 and the other one came in at 0.277. So one of the rear pins is undersized, and one of the pins is just about right, but I won't be using New Frontier Armory. Okay, so these pins are from KAK, and detents, latching, everything, machining, they fit really nice, but the front was just a little bit undersized. The rear came in at 0.277, which that's good. And so these pins are good. But like I said, the front for me, for what I'm trying to do here, a little bit undersized. They'll work fine. You'll have very little wobble. You'll have some, but very little. Okay, so on the K&S Precision, the push pins, the spring-loaded ball bearings, both front and rear came in at 0.278, which is like perfect. I mean, for this receiver coming in at the low end at 0.279, that gives you 1/1000th of an inch clearance between the pin and the bore. And that was going to be a nice snug fit. You wouldn't have any slop at all between your upper and your lower receiver. But I had second thoughts about the ball bearings sticking out on the side of the receiver. Now on their AR-15 pins, they make this a little bit longer and they put a sling swivel adapter that fits on the end of this and has a much better looking appearance, and then gives you an option of putting a sling on your pins if you wanted to. But they don't do that for 308. For some reason, you don't get the sling swivel end caps. So you're going to stuck with the ball bearings sticking out there in outer space. The other plus to these being 278 and a perfect fit would be that because they're push pins, I get to eliminate the spring and detent. So I don't have to worry about putting those in. I can get rid of those if I wanted to. So even though these pins would fit the best, I'm probably going to go with their standard takedown pins and pivot pins. These came in at 0.277. So that's still going to be a reasonably snug fit. You're only 0.002 under what I measured on the bore. So I'm probably going to go with these. And so we'll get those installed and see how everything ends up as far as how much wobble or slop we have between the upper and the lower receivers. Okay, so I backed off the tensioning lug, so there's going to be no contact with this and the upper receiver lug. So that way I can get an idea of how well these pins actually fit when we put these two together and see how much movement or wobble we get. So let's put them together and see what happens. Okay, so it's probably kind of be hard to tell on camera, but I virtually have no movement at all, no wobble with just the pins. So as things wear in or whatever, if I do end up with a little bit of slop, I still have that tensioning lug to where I can snug things up. So anyway, I ended up going with the mil-spec type spring and detent pins. These would have fit even better, but like I said, I don't know, I kind of decided against having the ball bearings sticking out and showing on the side of the receiver. So anyway, K&S for the win. Okay, so this is the K8Ks that would have worked just fine also. One thing about the K8K versus K&S is K8K dimples theirs, where K&S are smooth, but I don't really care about that. Okay, so final thoughts on the Aero Precision takedown and pivot pins. New Frontier Armory, you guys make fantastic receivers. They are in spec, they are on the tight side. No problem with your receivers. However, your takedown pins and your pivot pins, final thoughts. All right, Pete North Las Vegas, over and out. Hope you enjoyed the Golden Cannonball story.